Hello and welcome to the second episode of this lecture series, which I have called Fjölkyngi, Stories about Seidr and Initiation. And stories are exactly what this series is about. I want to share all the source stories that we have which cover in one way or other the subject of Fjölkyngi, great magical knowledge, of which Seidr was considered the most powerful and closely related to all the other forms of great knowledge. I will also discuss these stories, of course, and see them in connection with other stories and present them in clusters of themes. So in the last episode, I presented you with various stories about how Seidr and Fjölkyngi came about, legends and myths about the original practitioners, and how they introduced these sport, idrotter, to the people, and what it was all about. I mentioned shamanism as an ethnographic umbrella term for traditions that include the invocations of spirits for guidance, healing, and divination, as well as journeys in spirit, often in the shape of animals, into other worlds. Often for the same purpose of guidance, healing, and divination. And I mentioned that such practices were very much a part of Seidr. However, this second episode, will be about Seidr as a tradition of oracular divination. And in this one, I have gathered the stories of Gambara, Albruna, Veleda, Ganna, and Valiborg. These were Iron Age Germanic oracles who became famous to the Roman Empire. I've also gathered 4 different saga stories in 5 different sagas about Völur, wand witches, as I explained in the last episode, operating as local oracles in pre-Christian Scandinavia, or Iceland or Greenland. And I will finally relate and discuss the seances of oracular divination Seidr in the poetic Edda myths. Now, since I am very much into comparative studies, as you may have noticed, I think it is relevant here to briefly mention an ancient European tradition of oracular divination, which was once at the heart and center of the classical Bronze Age and Iron Age Europe, and which seems closely related to the Germanic kind. And the most important of all these oracles, at least the most important to us living today, because this is the one we have the most sources about, was the Oracle of Delphi. And the Oracle of Delphi had a title. She was called the Pythia. Now, if you have watched any sort of movie and even documentary about the Oracle of Delphi, it is very likely that you may have been exposed to some scene where the Pythia, the priestess, the oracle, wearing, of course, nothing but a bikini and transparent flowing garments, performing a highly orgiastic dance, let's say, as if she was really hoping for some sexy time or dollars in her bikini, in her mini bikini. And if you're lucky, you might even see that she gets to be licked in the face by old piggy priests with really a lot of warts, while she hoarsely and sexily, lying on her back, of course, whispers something for the priest to say to the fully armed and skeptical visitor. Yeah, well, as exciting it probably was for the producers or directors of said film clips, even in documentaries, there's absolutely nothing in the sources to confirm any sort of practice like this at all. Quite on the contrary. The oracle would usually have been a middle-aged to elderly woman, and the visitors would have been respectful. They would have pilgrimage to get to her temple. They would walk long distances on sacred paths, ritually, ceremonially, towards her temple. They would ritually be purifying themselves. They would pray and make sacrifices and going through lots of ceremonies. And they would certainly not go in there with fully armed and with a skeptical attitude, actually. They would then they would then offer their questions to the oracle, and they would actually tell the priest, who would write the questions down on tablets and then offer these tablets to the oracle so that she could read them. Yes, read. Back in the Bronze Age, Iron Age, that was not for everyone. So instead of this dancing young girl, we have a middle-aged woman seated on a throne, actually, like enthroned on a three-legged chair, and breathing in these gases and reading the tablets. And then she would go into a trance, and then she would offer her prophecies in riddles and in verse form, like she would actually make poetry out of her prophecy in very recognized old verse forms. So she would have been a very highly educated person as well in order to be able to do this, and even in a state of trance. The image we have of the oracle, the Pythia, has been sort of thwarted a bit by these popular movies and even some documentaries that are also fallen prey to this image of the dancing, see-through garment, sexy oracle. I'm sorry to disappoint you all, but she was probably a bit less boring than that, but so interesting. And we're gonna go through this now. So, let us begin with a reading, the story of Gambara of the Langobardi. Now, first of all, the Langobardi were a Germanic tribe whose particular history was described in 3 different sources. The Origo Gentis Langobardum, which means the origin of the Langobard people, which dates from something like 650 AD. And we also have the Historia Langobardum by Paulus Diaconus, I think you English people call it Paul the Deacon, from about 790 AD. And partly we also find the same story in Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum, which means the history of the Danish people, and which dates from the late 12th century. According to all 3 sources, the Langobardi believed that they originated on an island in Scandinavia, and that they used to call themselves by the tribal name Winili. Around the year 0, the population of the island had grown to a point where there was no longer enough food to sustain everybody. the population was divided in 3 parts, and lots were thrown about which 1/3 part of the population would have to leave the tribal land. Imagine that, you have a tribe living on an island and there are too many people, so you cast lots, and 1/3 of the population have to actually just leave. That was the reality back then, and probably a reason for the big migration age. So the group that had to leave elected as their kings the brothers Ibor and Ion, and their mother Gambara partook in the leading of the emigrants and was described as a very wise woman who enjoyed tremendous trust in the population. So she was a very important person here, and her name, Gambara, this may be a Latinized version of the Old Norse Gambara, which means wand carrier. Actually, she was carrying a wand. Gambara. So the emigrating Vinili came to a place that they called Skåringa, which roughly just means shore. And nobody knows where this was, but it could have been somewhere between Poland and Germany. And the place was already populated by another Germanic tribe, the Vandals. And this was before the Vandals ended up in North Africa. They were still here somewhere in Poland or Germany. And it is assumed that these dwelled in the area between the rivers Oder and Elben. The chiefs of the Vandals demanded taxes from the Vinili, and if they did not want to pay, they would be met with a war, and the Vinili decided to fight. So the Vandals, they turned to their god Wotan, Odin, and asked for victory in their battle against the Vinili. Wotan replied that to the first people I see at sunrise, I shall give the victory. The Vinili, on the other hand, turned to the goddess Freya, which is Freya or Frigg, and asked for victory to their people. So according to a later version of the story, the latest version is in Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum, chapter 8, 284. It was Gambara, the wise mother of the 2 kings, who approached Freya, the goddess Freya. And Freya instructed Gambara, or instructed the Vinili people, that everyone should come to them by sunrise, and that their women should bind their long hairs across their faces to make it look like they had beards. At sunrise, Freya turned her husband Wotan towards the sunrise and woke him up to the sight of all the Vinili. At the sight of the women with very, very long beards, Wotan asked, "Who are these long beards, Langobardi?" And Freya replied, "Now that you have given them a name, you must also give them victory." So she used some cunning here to make her husband, or Wotan, to make him give victory to her side, actually, the people who had prayed to her, instead of the people who had prayed to him. So Wotan gave the victory to the Vinili, and from this moment on, they were always described as Langobardi. And due to the pressures of the migration era, the tribe kept moving and finally became known as the Lombards of Lombardia in Italy. In any way, this is a story about a whole tribe and how they got their name, and how they related to their gods. And the important thing here to us is that we have a woman, the mother of 2 kings, and her name was probably Gambara, the wand carrier, which means that she was probably a vulva. She contacted the gods, and she contacted the goddess, actually, and she was also the one who informed the people, her people, about what the goddess had planned for them in order to win the war, and they did win the war. So that was Gambara. So, I'm going to begin with a story about a völva who predicts emigration to Iceland. And there are two sources to this story. The first source is Vatnsdæla saga, and that would be chapter 10. And the other source to the same story is Landnåmabok, chapter 56. In Vatnsdæla saga, the farmer Ingjaldr in Norway invites, and it says after old custom, foreign sed. He invites to a large banquet where also Finna ein fjølkunnig, a Sami woman of great magical knowledge. Yes, Finna, it directly translated as Finn, but it was a common way of referring to the Sami people. So since this was happening in Norway, it is very likely a Sami woman and not a Finnish woman. And she was fjølkunnig. Finna ein fjølkunnig. She was a woman of great magical knowledge. She was also invited. And with her Seidr, she could discover the destinies of all the guests. And the Sami woman, she's either called Finna hin fjølkunniga, or a völva. So she was a Sami völva. And this is something, but she's referred to both things. She's referred to as fjølkunnig, she's referred to as völva, and she's referred to as Sami. When the Sami völva performs Seidr for a young man, Ingimundr, she lets him know that he and his two brothers are going to migrate to Iceland. And at this time, this was in the 860s AD, and Iceland was still largely unsettled. It was discovered and things, but they knew about it, but it didn't have a real community yet. So after a deal of doubt, Ingimundr and his family decide that this prophecy is a point from fate, and therefore they do emigrate to Iceland. So in a way, if the völva had not told them that they were going to emigrate to Iceland, they might not have, because they actually emigrated because of her. So somehow her prophecy was not only seen as a prophecy, but also as a sort of demand, a matter of fate. So they might as well just get going. And I'm going to read to you from Vatnsdæla saga, where the Sami völva predicts emigration, because it does describe the process a lot. So I read. After the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 870 AD, Ingimundr returned home to his father with much honor. Thorstein received him with open arms and said he had known fortune in his choice. He stayed there over the winter, and the same winter Ingjaldr came to Thorstein. What was a joyful encounter. Ingjaldr said that now that he was having such good progress, he wanted to invite Ingimundr to a banquet. Ingimundr promised to come. Ingjaldr, the one who invited, returned home and invited many other men to the banquet. At this banquet, Ingjaldr had, after old custom, eftir fornum sið, prepared for Seidr, efnaðar Seidr, so that people could learn about their destinies. And for this reason, he had invited a very wise Sami woman, Finna ein fjølkunnig. Ingimundr and Grimur came to the banquet with a large following. The Sami woman was seated high on an elevated chair that had been beautifully decorated. I'll read it in Norse. Finnen var sett hot og boid hana veglega. Then each man moved from his own seat and went to ask her about his destiny, Örlög. And she prophesied each one about how he would fare, but not everybody were happy about the replies they received. The foster brothers stayed seated in their places and did not go to ask her. They said that they did not care about her prophecies. The völva said, "Why are these young men not asking about their destinies?" They occur to me to be the most noticeably strange of all the men who have come together here. It was unusual that someone would miss the opportunity to ask the Völva when she was there. Ingimundur said, I do not want to know my fate beforehand, and I do not think that I depend on advice coming from beneath your tongue's roots. Tungorutum. She replied, but I will still tell you something without being asked. You are going to build in a land that is called Iceland. It is still widely unsettled, but there you are going to become a much esteemed man and old, and many of your descendants will likewise become famous men in that same country. So she prophesies a good future for him and his descendants if he goes there. Ingimundur said, it is actually suitable, since I have certainly decided to never go to that place. And I would not be a good trading man if I sold my many and good ancestral fields in order to move over to deserted and wild settlements. So he doesn't want to go, basically, and he would lose money from this. And the Sami woman replied, it will still turn out as I'm saying, and a sign of this is the image that Harald King gave you in Hafrsfjord. It has vanished out of your purse and may now be found in that place in Iceland where you are going to settle. On it, Frey's image is graven in silver, and when you are building your farm, then you will see that my words were true. So basically, Ingimundur has this image, a graven image of the god Freyr that he has in his purse, and he has been carrying this in his purse. But now, when the Völva, the Sami Völva, is talking to him, she tells him that it's no longer in his purse, but that it's magically going to appear in Iceland of all places, and that it's already there. So it sort of magically vanished from his purse and ended up in Iceland. Ingimundur said, if it was not against my foster father's wishes, you would have paid for your prophecy, but since I'm not a violent man, I shall let it pass. She said that there was no reason to get angry about this. He'd lost his graven image of his god. He replied that she had come there in a bad time, upon which she again replied that all would turn out like she had said, whether he liked it or not. At last she said, Grimr, that's Ingimund's brother, shares this destiny too, and so does his brother Rodmundur. So, and both of them will be great farmers. So this was for all the three brothers. The morning after, Ingimundur searched for his image, the image of Freyr, but could not find it. What seemed to him a bad omen. But Ingjaldr asked him to be glad and not to worry, since there were many a brave man who did not find it shameful to migrate to Iceland, and that he had invited the Sami woman with the best of intentions. So Ingimundr suspected that Ingjald had sort of paid or bribed the Völva to give a prophecy that made him actually leave the country. But Ingjaldr declares that he had invited the woman with the best of intentions, and Ingimundur said that he would not thank him for it, even if nothing could break their friendship. So he does go to Iceland with his brothers eventually, and he does find his graven image in the ground somewhere where he's digging, and that's where he builds his farm, and everything goes as the Völva said. Now there is a second version of this story, which is found in the Landnoma book. This is a book about the settlement of Iceland that was written back in 13th century or something. In this passage, the Völva is not called a Sami Völva. She's not called a Finna, but she's called Seidr Völva. So in this passage from the book about the settlement of Iceland, we hear that a certain Seidr Völva prophesies that the same Ingimundur and his kindred moved to and built in Iceland. In this source, nothing is said about the Völva being of Sami stock, Rather, she's given a typical Norse name often applied to Völur in the sagas, Seidr. Seidr Völva prophesied for all of them that they should build in that land which had been discovered in the Western Ocean, and Ingimundr said that he did not want to do that. The Völva told him to look for omens, and that he would find an image lost from his purse in the place where he needed to build, just when he would be digging out space for the pillars for his house. So needless to say, the Völva's prophecy turned out to be true. Ingimundr really did find the image, which had magically vanished from his purse in Norway, and ended up, it was refound while he was digging out in the ground for the pillars of his new house upon arrival in Iceland. Whether the Völva's name was really Seidr, which is a Norse name, or whether she was really Sami, or perhaps even Finnish, we shall never really know. But Vatnsdæla saga is one of several sources which hint as to how Norse people may have actually sought Sami shamans, because the Sami culture was, while we are discussing whether Seidr could be called shamanism or not, the Sami culture certainly was shamanistic. There is no doubt about that at all. And it appears that there have been some Norse people who have actually sought Sami shamans, and that they thought, especially, and this was especially true after the conversion to Christianity, because then Norse people were no longer allowed to practice this, while the Sami still practiced these pagan shamanistic rituals, and Norse-speaking people started to seek Sami shamans instead of Norse side people. So but this was even before that. This was still in pagan times. So while the events described happened in deep pagan times, the chroniclers may have added something of their own from their own era, when this sort of practice was only common to the Sami, or when nobody could remember the name of that particular Völva, but everybody remembered that was the name of the most famous of Völur in the Poetic Edda is called Seidr. So they tended to actually name all the Völur that they talk about as Seidr or something similar. So
Völur allar frå Vidolfi, Vittkar aller frå Vilmeidi, Seidberendur frå Svarthöfti, Jötnar aller frå Ymikomnir. Sjå sigtivar syrgjanennu, Vigjar at veum, vargspelg seldo, Let färast, lyndi bröyti, Lek at lävisi, litom skipti.
So I hope you enjoyed this 2-hour or more episode about oracular Seidr. The next time I will be talking about practical Seidr, like healing Seidr, and how to find lost objects, and how to call in the game or the fish and things like that. So bye for now.